They sat in the front row, snickering with the confidence of predators watching wounded prey, unaware that the trap door beneath their feet had already been unlatched by my hand. The auditorium smelled of burnt coffee and damp wool, a stale scent that seemed to cling to the velvet curtains of the Columbus Civic Hall. It was the kind of smell that usually made me nauseous, but today my stomach was already twisted into such tight knots that the atmosphere barely registered. I stood in the wings of the stage, partially obscured by a heavy drape, watching them. They were already laughing. My mother, Patricia, leaned toward my sister, Tessa, and covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her shoulders shaking in that sharp, private amusement families use when they think they have won something. They sat in the front row, center seats, as if they were attending a Broadway premiere rather than a dry, bureaucratic hearing on municipal grants and ethics. My dad, Frank, didn't even look up from his phone, his thumb scrolling rhythmically, utterly unbothered by the gravity of the room. I almost turned around and walked out. The impulse was physical, a sudden jerk of my legs wanting to carry me back to the safety of the parking lot, back to the anonymity of being the disappointment. I had borrowed this navy blazer from a friend back in Austin, Venmo-ing her $5 as a joke apology for sweating through it later. Now, looking at my hands, I realized that wasn't a joke. My palms were slick. My fingers trembled. I wasn't shaking because I was scared of the panels sitting behind the long oak table on the stage. I was shaking because my family had absolutely no idea why I was here. They thought I was about to be humiliated. For years, that had been our dynamic. It was an unspoken caste system within our own house. Tessa, with her light skin that Patricia always praised and her sensible career choices, was the investment. I, with my darker complexion and my stubborn insistence on pursuing non-profit oversight and community art, was the practice kid. Tessa got the paid internships in Brooklyn, the co-signed lease on a loft overlooking the bridge, and the wedding fund that sat in a high-yield savings account just in case. I got lectures about budgeting apps. I got the tough love talks about why student loans build character and why I shouldn't expect handouts. When I had called them a week ago to tell them I had been summoned to Columbus for the annual grant and ethics hearing, Patricia had laughed outright over the speakerphone. "Another rejection, Riley?" she had asked, her voice tinny and cruel. "Well, at least you're consistent. Maybe you can network while you're there. Try to look professional for once." So when they saw my name printed on the program under a section labeled public commentary, they assumed the worst. They assumed I had finally snapped, that I was there to beg for funding or make a scene about being overlooked by the Arts Council. That was why they came early. That was why they were smiling. They wanted a front row seat to my failure so they could dissect it over dinner later, using my humiliation as a cautionary tale to validate their own superiority. The moderator, a stern woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, tapped the microphone. The sound boomed through the hall, a dull thud-thud that silenced the murmuring crowd. "We will begin the final presentation shortly," she announced, shuffling a stack of papers. I felt my phone buzz in the pocket of my slacks. I didn't need to look to know who it was, but I pulled it out anyway. A blocked number. One word, ready? It was the team from Santa Monica. The twist, the one that made my heart hammer against my ribs, was that I hadn't spent the last 18 months failing. I had been quietly working with a top-tier nonprofit compliance team, tracing missing funds tied to a regional arts grant. It was a massive, multi-city allocation involving Austin, Columbus, and Brooklyn. It was the same grant my mother had bragged about helping oversee years ago when she sat on the Cultural Council board. I looked out at them again. Tessa was checking her reflection in her compact mirror, smoothing down a stray hair. She looked expensive. Her bag was designer. Her shoes were Italian leather. All paid for by the family trust that somehow never had enough liquidity when I needed help with rent, but always had enough for her luxuries. The unfairness of it usually crushed me. It usually made me feel small, like a child pressing her nose against the glass of a candy store she wasn't allowed to enter. But today, the unfairness felt like fuel. It felt like gasoline running through my veins. The panel chair cleared her throat, her voice echoing through the silent hall. "We are here to address discrepancies in the allocation of the Tri-State Cultural Development Fund." Patricia's smile didn't falter, but her posture stiffened slightly. She adjusted her scarf. She knew the name of the fund. She had helped draft the bylaws. But she was arrogant. She thought this was a formality, a boring audit that would end with a rubber stamp. She thought I was just a spectator, or worse, a desperate applicant. We will begin with the testimony of a whistleblower who submitted the initial evidence regarding shell companies and misappropriated assets. The chair continued. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The word whistleblower hung in the space between the stage and the front row like a charged wire. My father finally looked up from his phone. His brow furrowed. He looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at the moderator, her smile fading into a confused, tight line. I took a deep breath. The smell of old carpet didn't bother me anymore. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain, the stage lights blinding me for a fraction of a second before my vision cleared. The sound of my heels clicking against the wooden floorboards was loud, visual, unavoidable. I wasn't the daughter they pitted anymore. I wasn't the practice kid. I was the reckoning. Have you ever been the black sheep in your family, the one they laughed at, the one they bet against, the one they treated like a mistake while someone else got the glory? It hurts, doesn't it? That specific kind of betrayal leaves a scar that money can't fix and time rarely heals. If you are reading this and your heart is racing because you know exactly what that dismissal feels like, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you want to see the underdog finally bite back and serve justice cold. Do not just watch. Join the family that actually supports you. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from, and have you ever had to prove everyone wrong just to survive? We'll begin with a statement from the lead auditor, the chairwoman announced, her voice calm but amplifying the chaos about to ensue. She gestured toward me. Ms. Riley Morgan. My name echoed through the hall like a dropped plate shattering in a library. The effect was instantaneous. In the front row, Tessa's laughter cut off mid-breath, resulting in a strange, choked hiccup. Her mouth remained slightly open, her eyes darting from the program in her hand to the woman standing behind the podium. My father, Frank, froze, his phone still illuminated in his hand, the blue light casting a ghostly pallor on his confused face. But it was my mother, Patricia, who reacted most violently. The color drained from her face, so fast I thought she might actually faint. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white, her carefully applied foundation suddenly unable to hide the sheer terror rising beneath her skin. She looked like a ghost seeing its own grave. I didn't look at them. Not yet. I couldn't afford to let their shock humanize them in my eyes. If I made eye contact, I might falter. I might remember the birthdays where I was an afterthought, or the family dinners where I was the punchline. Instead, I gripped the edges of the podium. The wood was cool under my sweating palms. I looked at the panel of 5 judges, then up at the massive projection screen suspended above the stage. "Thank you, Madam Chair," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was lower than usual, anchored by 18 months of meticulous research and the simmering heat of a lifetime of being underestimated. The evidence I am presenting today concerns the systematic misappropriation of the Tri-State Grant, specifically funds allocated for minority youth arts programs in Brooklyn and Columbus. I pressed the clicker in my right hand. The screen behind me flickered to life. It wasn't a sob story. It was a spreadsheet, rows and columns of wire transfers, highlighted in damning red. As you can see, I continued, falling into the rhythm I had practiced in my tiny apartment mirror for weeks. Over a period of 4 years, 3 distinct nonprofit entities were created. On paper, these organizations, the Urban Canvas Initiative, Columbus Creatives, and Blue Horizon Arts, were meant to provide scholarships for underprivileged artists. I clicked again. A series of emails appeared. They were redacted in places, but the timestamps and subject lines were clear. However, these entities had no physical offices, no employees, no scholarship recipients. A murmur rippled through the audience behind me. The sound of shifting bodies and whispered gasps filled the room. I could feel the energy shifting. They weren't bored anymore. Instead, I said, my voice hardening, the funds were funneled into a single holding company based in Delaware. I risked a glance downward, just a flick of my eyes. Patricia was trembling. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the screen. She knew what was coming next. She knew because she had signed the checks. She had bought the lies, and she had used the money to build a life of comfort while telling me I wasn't working hard enough to deserve a loan for rent. "The holding company," I said, "is listed as P&F Holdings." I clicked the remote one last time for the opening segment. A scanned copy of a bank transfer authorization appeared on the screen. It was huge, crisp, and undeniable. And the primary beneficiary of PNF Holdings used the capital for personal real estate acquisitions, I stated. Specifically, a luxury loft in Brooklyn Heights. Tessa let out a sharp, audible gasp, her hand flying to her chest. The address on the screen was hers, but that wasn't the part that made the room go deadly silent. It was the signature at the bottom of the authorization form. It wasn't my mother's signature. It was mine, or rather, a clumsy forgery of it, dated 3 years ago, back when I was struggling to pay for groceries, and they were using my identity to launder their theft. I looked directly at my mother then. Her eyes met mine, wide and pleading, begging me to stop. But I simply leaned into the microphone. "I never signed this document," I said, my voice echoing into the stunned silence. "But I know who did." Patricia stood up. It was a jerky, unnatural motion, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, a screech that rivaled the feedback from the microphone. "This is a misunderstanding," she hissed, her voice cracking but loud enough to carry to the back of the room. She turned not to me, but to the panel, flashing a smile that was all teeth and terror. "My daughter, she's confused. She's always been dramatic. We've been dealing with her episodes for years." There it was, the classic DeMarco defense. Deny, deflect, diagnose. It was the same tone she used when I told her I wanted to study art history, delusional, or when I confronted her about treating me differently than Tessa, oversensitive. 4 years, that tone had silenced me. It had made me question my own reality. But today, standing behind the podium with a hard drive full of receipts, her voice sounded thin. It sounded like what it was, a lie. "She doesn't know what she's saying," Patricia continued, stepping into the aisle, her hand reaching out as if she could physically grab the air and stuff the truth back into a box. "We paid for that apartment. We helped her. This is how she repays us. With fantasies." Tessa was crying now, soft, hiccuping sobs. But she wasn't looking at me with remorse. She was scrolling frantically through her phone, deleting posts, I realized. She was erasing the digital trail of her independent lifestyle that my stolen identity had funded. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. That was Patricia's mistake. She thought she was the authority in every room she entered. She forgot that here, she was just a spectator. The panel chair, a woman who had spent 30 years auditing federal grants, leaned forward. She didn't look amused. She didn't look sympathetic to the distraught mother act. "Ma'am," the chair said, her voice dropping an octave, heavy with command. "Sit down." "But she's lying," Patricia shrilled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Frank, tell them." My father didn't move. He was staring at the screen, at the signature. He looked sick. "Ma'am," the chair repeated, "if you disrupt these proceedings again, you will be removed by security. Ms. Morgan has provided forensic evidence verified by the FBI's white-collar crimes division prior to this hearing." Patricia froze. The blood that had drained from her face seemed to pool in her neck, turning it blotchy and red. The mention of the FBI hit her like a physical blow. She sank back into her seat, not because she wanted to, but because her legs gave out. I turned back to the mic. "The drama my mother refers to," I said calmly, "is the fact that on the date that document was signed, October 14th, 3 years ago, I was not in Ohio. I was not in New York." I clicked the remote. A new image appeared, a hospital intake form. I was in an emergency room in Austin, being treated for exhaustion from working 3 jobs to pay the tuition they claimed they couldn't afford. I said, "I couldn't have signed for a wire transfer. But the metadata on the digital signature shows exactly where it originated." I looked at my father. "It didn't come from a bank," I said. "It came from an IP address registered to a residential home." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was painful. "Dad," I asked softly, "do you want to tell them which room the computer was in, or should I show the next slide?" Frank didn't speak. He crumbled. My father, a man who had spent my entire childhood lecturing me on the importance of keeping your head down and doing your job, looked as though his internal structure had simply dissolved. He stared at the screen, then at the floor, and finally, slowly, he turned his head toward his wife. "Patty," he whispered, his voice carrying in the dead silence of the auditorium. "You said you handled it. You said the accountant signed off." "Shut up, Frank," Patricia snapped, her voice low and venomous. She wasn't playing the victim anymore. She was a cornered animal baring its teeth. "Don't say another word." "I'm not going to jail for you," Frank blurted out, panic rising in his chest. He stood up, knocking his phone to the floor. "She told me it was a loophole. She said the funds were unused surplus." A collective gasp swept through the room. I watched, feeling a cold, detached sense of satisfaction. It had taken less than 5 minutes for the perfect family to turn into cannibals. They were eating each other alive to survive. "Mr. DeMarco," the chairwoman interrupted, "this is a public hearing, not a confession booth. Though I should inform you, everything occurring here is being recorded for the state prosecutor's office." Frank went pale. He sank back down, putting his head in his hands. Tessa was staring at me now. The tears had stopped. Her face was a mask of realization. She wasn't crying because she felt guilty. She was crying because she realized the loft, the clothes, the status. It was all radioactive. I turned back to the microphone. "My father is correct about one thing," I said. "He didn't orchestrate the scheme. He just enjoyed the benefits." But the architect was Patricia DeMarco. I clicked the remote. The spreadsheet vanished, replaced by a single email thread. It was dated 2 years ago. "The money wasn't just stolen," I said, my voice dropping. "It was targeted." The email on the screen was from Patricia to a contact at the bank named J. Miller. Subject: R. Morgan account access body. We need to move the next tranche before the fiscal year ends. Routed through Riley's old student account before sweeping it to the LLC. If anyone asks, we can just say she's bad with money. It's a believable narrative. She's a practice kid, remember? No one expects her to be competent. The cruelty of it, printed in 12-point Arial font, was breathtaking. It wasn't just theft. It was a character assassination planned years in advance. They hadn't just used my name. They had banked on my failure. They had bet on me being too weak, too stupid, or too beaten down to ever notice. Patricia wasn't looking at the screen. She was staring at me with a hatred so pure it felt like heat radiating across the distance. "I have one final piece of evidence," I said, my hand hovering over the remote. "It's a recording. A voicemail left on the firm's compliance line 3 days ago, attempting to bribe an auditor to shred these files." I looked at Tessa. "It wasn't Mom who made the call," I said softly. I pressed the spacebar on the laptop. The audio quality was crystal clear, amplified by the hall speakers. There was no static, no ambiguity. Just the distinct, slightly vocal-fried voice of my sister, Tessa. "Hi, this is Tessa DeMarco. I'm calling regarding the discrepancy file you flagged. Look, my mother is very influential in the Cultural Council, and we'd hate for this to become a thing. If the P&F file were to, say, become corrupted during the data migration, there's a bonus in it for you. 5 figures. Just call me back. We can handle this like adults." The recording clicked off. Tessa didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply looked up at me, her face stripped of all its usual polished arrogance. For the first time in her life, she looked ugly. Not physically, but in the way a person looks when their soul is exposed as rot. "I was trying to fix it," she whispered, her voice carrying in the dead silence. She looked at our parents, desperate for validation. "I was trying to protect the assets. If they froze the accounts, I would have lost the lease." She wasn't trying to save the family. She was trying to save her apartment. She was trying to save the perception of herself as the success story. "Miss DeMarco," the chairwoman said, her tone icy. "Attempting to bribe a federal auditor is a felony, as is wire fraud." The chairwoman banged her gavel. It sounded like a gunshot. "This hearing is adjourned. We are turning all evidence over to the state attorney immediately. Officers." From the back of the hall, the doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers and 2 men in suits, detectives, likely, marched down the center aisle. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of their footsteps was the only sound in the room. My father began to weep. It was a pathetic, heaving sound. He grabbed Patricia's arm, but she shook him off. Patricia stood up. She smoothed her skirt with trembling hands. She looked at the approaching officers, then she looked up at the stage. She looked at me. I expected screaming. I expected her to curse me, to disown me, to make a scene that would land on the evening news. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a cold, jagged expression that didn't reach her eyes. She reached into her purse, causing one of the officers to shout, hands visible, and pulled out her sunglasses. She slid them onto her face, masking her terror with a veneer of untouchable haughtiness. "You think you've won, Riley," she called out, her voice steady but strained. "You think you're the hero of the story." The officers reached the front row. One of them took Frank's arm. Another moved toward Tessa, who recoiled, shrieking, "Don't touch me. Do you know who I am?" Patricia let the officer take her wrist. As the cuffs clicked, a metallic sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones, she didn't take her eyes off me. "Enjoy the applause, baby girl," she said. "But remember who taught you how to survive." They were led away. The double doors swallowed them whole. The flash of cameras from the press pit erupted like lightning. I stood alone at the podium. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt triumphant. I had exposed the rot. I had severed the limb to save the body. I packed up my laptop, my hands finally shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. I walked down the steps of the stage, ignoring the reporters shouting questions. I just wanted fresh air. I pushed through the side exit into the cool Columbus afternoon. I leaned against the brick wall, inhaling deeply, trying to steady my heart rate. My phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting a message from the nonprofit team. A congratulations, or good job. It was the blocked number again. The one that had texted Reddy at the start of the hearing. I opened the message. Phase 1 complete. The DeMarcos are down. Now we can talk about the people who gave your mother the money in the first place. I stared at the screen. My mother hadn't stolen the money alone. She had been given it, and whoever gave it to her was still out there. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Phase 1. The implications sat heavy in my gut. I had spent 18 months thinking I was dissecting a family grievance, a localized tumor of greed within the DeMarco household. I thought I was cutting out the rot of my own childhood. I hadn't realized I was merely scratching the surface of a much larger, darker organism. The alley door behind me banged open. "Ms. Morgan! Ms. Morgan, over here!" The paparazzi had found the side exit. I turned, ready to run, but a black sedan screeched to a halt at the curb, cutting off the line of sight between me and the photographers. The passenger door popped open. "Get in," a voice commanded from the driver's seat. "Now!" I didn't hesitate. I threw my bag into the footwell and dove into the leather seat, slamming the door just as a camera flash exploded against the tinted glass. The car peeled away, merging aggressively into the Columbus traffic. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the driver. He was white, maybe early 30s, with sharp features and the kind of intense, sleepless eyes that suggested he lived on caffeine and adrenaline. He wore a gray suit that cost more than my entire year's rent, but his tie was loosened, and his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "You cut it close, Riley," he said, checking the rearview mirror. "You're late, Hayes." I shot back, recognizing the voice. Graham Hayes. He was the head of the compliance unit in Santa Monica. We had spoken on the phone for hundreds of hours, exchanged thousands of encrypted emails, but we had never met in person. He was the one who had guided me through the forensic accounting, the one who had taught me how to track the shell companies. "Traffic was a nightmare," Hayes muttered. "And your mother's arrest is already trending. You did good in there. Better than good. You gutted them." "I did what had to be done," I said, looking out the window as the city flew by. "But what was that text? What do you mean?" "Phase 1. Hayes sighed, a sharp exhale through his nose. He took a hard left, heading toward the highway on-ramp. "Did you really think Patricia DeMarco was smart enough to invent a tri-state laundering scheme on her own?" Hayes asked. "Your mother is greedy, Riley. She's entitled, but she's not a mastermind. She was a middleman." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. "A middleman for who?" "The tri-state grant wasn't just public money," Hayes explained, his voice grim. "It was matched by private donors. Anonymous philanthropists who use arts funding to wash cash from less savory industries. Construction kickbacks, offshore gambling, you name it. They needed someone foolish and arrogant to sign the checks. Someone who felt untouchable. My mother, I whispered. Exactly. The DeMarcos were the perfect patsies. They got to play rich, and the real architects got their money cleaned. Hayes glanced at me. By exposing your family, you didn't just embarrass them. You froze about $40 million belonging to people who don't file lawsuits. They break legs. I stared at him. So I'm in danger? We both are, Hayes said calmly. That's why we aren't going to the hotel. I looked at the road signs. We were heading north, out of the city limits, toward the private airfield. Where are we going? I asked. Hayes tightened his grip on the wheel. We're going to the source. The money trail didn't end with your sister's apartment, Riley. It ended in a private account in the Caymans. And 5 minutes ago, that account was accessed from a secure server inside a penthouse in Manhattan. He looked at me, a grim smile playing on his lips. Pack your bags, practice kid. We're going to New York. And you're going to hate the man we have to meet next. The elevator ride to the penthouse of the Obsidian Tower in Hudson Yards was silent and ear-poppingly fast. My stomach was still somewhere over the Midwest. We had taken a private charter, paid for, Hayes claimed, by emergency operational funds, and landed in Teterboro just an hour ago. Now, we were ascending into the clouds of Manhattan to meet the man who owned the sky. Listen to me, Hayes said, straightening his tie in the mirrored reflection of the elevator doors. Elias Thorne isn't your mother. He doesn't care about social standing. He doesn't care about shame. He deals in leverage. Do not let him see you sweat. I don't sweat, I said, though my palms were damp against the fabric of my slacks. I just destroyed my entire family on national television. I think I can handle a conversation. This isn't a conversation, Hayes warned as the elevator chimed. It's a negotiation for our lives. The doors slid open. The apartment was less of a home and more of a museum. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls looked out over the glittering grid of New York City. The walls were hung with genuine Basquiats and Rothkos. Ironic, considering the millions stolen from community arts programs were likely funding this private collection. A man stood by the window, his back to us. He wore a velvet smoking jacket that looked ridiculous on anyone else, but somehow seemed terrifyingly appropriate on him. He turned slowly. Elias Thorne was older than I expected, silver-haired with eyes that looked like chips of flint. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. Ms. Morgan, he said. His voice was smooth, like gravel tumbling in oil. And Mr. Hayes, you made excellent time. You were expecting us, Hayes said, stepping forward, his body tense. I monitor my investments, Thorne said, taking a sip. When the DeMarco account was frozen, I knew the pests had finally eaten the foundation. I must say, Riley, may I call you Riley? Your performance in Columbus was visceral, truly cinematic. I didn't do it for your entertainment, I snapped, stepping past Hayes. I did it to stop you. The DeMarcos are in custody. They'll talk. They'll give you up to cut a deal. Thorne laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Patricia and Frank don't know my name, he said dismissively. They dealt with intermediaries of intermediaries. To them, I am just a shell company in the Cayman Islands. They can scream until their throats bleed. They have nothing to trade. He walked over to a sleek ebony desk and picked up a thick manila folder. I, however, Thorne said, his eyes locking onto mine, have plenty to trade. We have the digital trail, Hayes interjected. We trace the IP. You traced what I allowed you to trace, Thorne countered. He dropped the folder onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. I needed the DeMarcos liquidated. They were becoming sloppy, greedy. Patricia began asking for more than her share. You, Riley, were simply the most efficient eviction notice I could find. I felt the blood drain from my face. You used me. I utilized an available asset, Thorne corrected. But now that the DeMarcos are gone, we have a new piece of business to discuss. He slid the folder across the polished wood toward me. You think your mother hated you because you were the practice kid, don't you? You think she treated you like garbage because you were simply the firstborn trial run. Thorne smiled, and it was the coldest thing I had ever seen. Open the file, Riley. Patricia didn't hate you because you were a mistake. She hated you because of who your real father is. My fingers felt numb as I flipped open the manila folder. I expected to see more bank statements, more wire transfers, maybe a secret offshore account in my name that I didn't know about. Instead, I saw a photograph. It was an old Polaroid, grainy and fading at the edges. It showed a young woman with laughing eyes and teased hair, my mother, Patricia. But she wasn't with Frank. She was leaning against a brick wall in Soho, her arm draped around a tall, black man with intense, creative eyes and a smile that looked terrifyingly like my own. Underneath the photo was a birth certificate. Mother, Patricia DeMarco. Father, Isaiah Vance. The room seemed to tilt. I grabbed the edge of the ebony desk to steady myself. Isaiah Vance. I knew that name. Every art student knew that name. He was a visionary, the founder of the original urban canvas movement in the early 90s. He had vanished mysteriously decades ago, and his intellectual property had been absorbed by... My eyes widened. Absorbed by the Cultural Council. By Patricia. She didn't steal the money from the state, Riley, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She stole it from him. She stole his nonprofit model, his contacts, and his funding. And she stole you. I looked up at him, my vision blurring. Frank isn't my father. Frank is a mediocre accountant who agreed to raise another man's child in exchange for a cut of the empire, Thorne sneered. Why do you think you were the practice kid? Why do you think they treated you like an intruder in your own home? You were the living, breathing evidence of their greatest crime. Every time Patricia looked at you, she saw the man she betrayed. A sound escaped my throat. A laugh, but it sounded jagged, like glass. It made sense. The coldness, the separation, the way Tessa was the investment, and I was the debt. I wasn't just a disappointment to them, I was a hostage. Isaiah Vance was a genius, Thorne continued, walking around the desk to stand next to me. But he was bad at business. He trusted people. He trusted Patricia. When he threatened to expose her embezzlement, he was removed from the equation, and his assets were placed in a trust that could only be accessed by his biological heir upon her 25th birthday. He tapped a document at the bottom of the pile. That's why they kept you around, Riley. They couldn't kill you. They needed you to age into the key that would unlock the vault. That's what the hearing was really about. They were trying to declare you mentally incompetent so Patricia could take conservatorship over the trust. I felt Hayes step closer to me, his hand hovering near his jacket pocket. So what do you want, Thorne? Hayes asked, his voice low and dangerous. I want a partner, Thorne said, extending a hand toward me. The DeMarcos are gone, but the Vance Trust is worth hundreds of millions. I helped Patricia steal the initial seed money, but the bulk of it is still locked away. Join me, Riley. Reclaim your father's legacy. We can run the city. I looked at his hand. It was manicured, steady and soaked in blood. I looked back down at the file, at the date of Isaiah Vance's disappearance. Then I saw a medical invoice stuck to the back of the photo. It was dated only 6 months ago. It was a bill for long-term care at a private facility in upstate New York. You said he was removed from the equation. I whispered, my heart stopping. You didn't say he was dead? Thorne's smile faltered for the first time. Where is he? I demanded, slamming the folder shut. Thorne sighed, checking his watch. He is in a place where he can't hurt us. Unless, of course, you decline my offer. He pressed a button on his desk. The glass walls of the penthouse suddenly turned opaque, and the doors locked with a heavy mechanical thunk. I'm afraid, Thorne said, that I can't let you leave until you sign. The mechanical lock of the penthouse doors echoed with finality, sealing us in a glass cage suspended 80 stories above Manhattan. Thorne stood by his desk, smugness radiating off him like heat. He tapped the document with a manicured finger. Sign the transfer of trusteeship, Riley, Thorne commanded, and I'll give you the address of the facility where your father is rotting. Refuse, and you'll disappear. The NYPD will find your body in the Hudson, another tragic suicide of a woman overwhelmed by her family scandal. I looked at the pen he had slid across the desk. It was heavy, expensive. A Mont Blanc. I picked it up. Thorne smiled, thinking he had won. You're right about one thing, Elias, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. I am my father's daughter. I looked at Hayes. He hadn't moved, but his posture had shifted. His weight was on the balls of his feet. But you're wrong about the leverage, I continued. I flipped the pen over in my hand, gripping it like a dagger. You can't kill me. If I die before I'm 30, the Vance Trust dissolves into a charitable donation for public schools. Isaiah wrote a poison pill into the bylaws. I read them when I hacked my mother's cloud storage. Thorne's smile vanished. You're bluffing. Am I? I stepped closer. Kill me, and you lose $400 million. Keep me alive, and I drag you to court until you're bankrupt. Thorne snarled, his composure snapping. He reached into his desk drawer, his hand coming up with a snub-nosed revolver. I don't need you willing, he spat. I just need your hand on the paper. He never got the chance to aim. Hayes moved with a speed that was terrifying. He didn't move like an accountant. He moved like a soldier. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the side table and hurled it. It shattered against Thorne's wrist, sending the gun skittering across the marble floor. Before Thorne could scream, Hayes vaulted the desk, tackling the older man into the high-backed leather chair. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of Thorne. Hayes twisted Thorne's arm behind his back, slamming his face into the mahogany surface. Riley! The computer! Hayes shouted, his voice strained as Thorne struggled beneath him. I didn't hesitate. I lunged for the laptop on the desk. It was still logged in. I frantically minimized the transfer documents, searching the desktop for a folder labeled Assets. There it was. Vance I double-clicked. A window popped up. Location: Beacon Hill Sanatorium, upstate New York. Ward 4, room 302. I got it! I yelled. Get his thumb! Hayes grunted. Thorne was thrashing now, cursing vilely. I grabbed Thorne's free hand. He tried to claw at me, but I slammed his palm down onto the biometric sensor on the desk console. Access granted. The heavy doors hissed and unlocked. Go! Hayes shoved Thorne's head down one last time, grabbed the gun from the floor, and backed away, keeping the weapon trained on the architect. We sprinted for the elevator. As the doors slid shut, I saw Thorne staggering to his feet, blood streaming from his nose, reaching for his phone. He's calling security, I gasped as the elevator plummeted toward the lobby. Worse, Hayes said, holstering the gun and pulling out his own phone. He looked at the message on the screen, and his face went pale. He's not calling security here. He's calling the sanatorium. He looked at me, his eyes wide with urgency. He just issued a scrub order, Riley. We have 40 minutes to get to Beacon Hill before they execute your father. The iron gates of Beacon Hill Sanatorium were no match for the reinforced bumper of the SUV Hayes had commandeered. We smashed through the lock at 60 miles an hour, metal screeching against metal, sending sparks flying into the twilight. Ward 4 is the east wing. Hayes shouted, wrestling the wheel as the car fishtailed on the gravel. Get ready to run! We skidded to a halt in front of the brick entrance. Hayes was out before the engine died, kicking the glass doors open with a violence that shattered the quiet facade of the facility. I was right behind him, my lungs burning, the folder clutched to my chest like a shield. Federal agents! Hayes roared, flashing a badge I hadn't seen before. The receptionist screamed and ducked. Where's room 302? Third floor, she stammered, pointing to the stairs. But Dr. Kovic just went up. He said there was an emergency transfer. Move! I yelled, taking the stairs 2 at a time. My heart hammered a rhythm against my ribs. Not too late, not too late. We burst onto the third-floor landing. The hallway was sterile, white, and terrifyingly silent. At the far end, a door stood ajar. We sprinted. Inside room 302, a man in scrubs stood over a hospital bed, a syringe poised over the 4-line. Step away from him! Hayes leveled the gun, his chest heaving. The orderly froze, the needle hovering inches from the port. He looked at Hayes, then at the man in the bed, panic flitting across his eyes. I have orders. Your orders are cancelled, I said, stepping into the room. And Thorne is already in custody. It was a bluff. The police were likely just arriving at the penthouse now, but it worked. The orderly's resolve crumbled. He set the syringe on the tray and backed away, hands raised. Hayes moved in, cuffing him to the bed rail with efficient, practiced movements. I didn't watch them. My eyes were fixed on the man in the bed. Isaiah Vance was older than the photo, his hair gray, and his face gaunt from years of confinement and medication. But the eyes, deep, creative, and intelligent, were the same. They were my eyes. He blinked, fighting through the fog of sedation. He looked at me, confusion clouding his gaze. "Patricia!" he rasped, his voice unused and gravelly. I walked to the bedside and took his hand. It was warm. "No," I whispered, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. "I'm Riley. I'm your daughter." He stared at me, searching my face. Slowly, a trembling hand reached up to touch my cheek. "Riley," he breathed, as if the name was a prayer he had been whispering for 25 years. You have a spark." 6 months later, the headline on the New York Times lying on my desk read, "Cultural Council Scandal Concludes. DeMarco and Thorne sentenced to 25 years. I traced the words with my finger. Patricia was gone. Frank was gone. Tessa was working at a retail counter in Jersey, learning what budgeting actually meant. I stood up and walked to the window of the new Vance Foundation headquarters in Brooklyn. The view was spectacular. The bridge, the skyline, the endless possibility. "Boss!" I turned. Hayes was leaning against the doorframe, looking sharp in a suit that actually fit. He held a tablet. "The board is ready for the quarterly review. And your father wants to know if you're coming down to the studio later. He says the light is perfect for the portrait." I smiled. My dad, my real dad, was recovering faster than anyone expected. He was painting again, reclaiming the years they had stolen from him, one canvas at a time. "Tell him I'll be there in 10, I said. I picked up my blazer, not the borrowed one, but a new one, tailored in mind. I wasn't the practice kid anymore. I wasn't the investment or the debt. I walked out of the office, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Loud. Visual. Unavoidable. My name had echoed through the hall to destroy a lie. Now, it was echoing to build a legacy.